Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whichever it is. Purpose of these videos for your homework is so that you've got a source of information and you can do quick revision. If you watch it once, brilliant. If you watch it twice, make notes, etc. The purpose being that you do something memorable. If you don't make it memorable, you'll forget it again in a few days. So reading through a revision guide, reading through your notes, copying out the same old notes won't make it memorable. If you're trying to draw pictures, well, that went on at the wrong time, but never mind. If you're trying to draw pictures, if you're just putting down the key words, if you use colour, if you make it memorable and make things link together, so next to Darwin we have his theory, we have brief notes about his theory, what about those and different species. So the purpose of a mind map is to link things together, and then that helps your memory because in your mind it will link things together too. So let's start. What is an ecosystem? Now the other thing I'd say is, what I've tried to do is, any word in red is a word you need to know the definition of. So that's a word that would appear on your mind map. And maybe next to an ecosystem you have brief notes or a picture or something for what it is. So an ecosystem, looking at this picture, it would be the animals, it would be the plants, it would be all the tiny microorganisms and insects and everything you can't see there, it would be the fish. There you go, there's a fish swimming in the river, it's a happy fish. It would also be the water and the temperature of the water. It would also be the soil and the quality of the soil. It would also be the temperature and the mountain here and the terrain, the air quality. So actually an ecosystem is all of the living parts and the non-living, such as the weather and the temperature and the soil quality and air quality, so non-living, in a certain place. So when we talk about a jungle ecosystem, it will be everything about that environment. All of the animals, all of the organisms that are living, plants, microorganisms, bacteria, etc. Plus it would be the temperature, the rainfall, everything else that's non-living. So any word in red should appear on your mind map. In an ecosystem, we say that there is a community of living things. So here the local community includes squid, cod, crabs, dolphins, phytoplankton, so tiny microscopic plants that feed from sunlight, zooplankton, tiny microscopic animals that feed, and they're often the start of food chains in a marine ecosystem. And then we've got other things on here with the ecosystem. We've got the effect of fishing, because obviously that will affect the food chains. So over here, commercial fishing. Over here we have farmland runoff, so chemicals that are put on farmland ending up running into the water, affecting the water quality. You might well have sewage runoff as well. We often have that off Portsmouth. So the ecosystem contains all of the animals there. Now the zooplankton eat phytoplankton. Without phytoplankton, the zooplankton would die out. The zooplankton then in turn are eaten by some fish. Those fish may well be eaten by the cod. So the fish goes to the cod, or the fish goes to the dolphin, or the fish goes to the commercial fishing, and if we take too many fish away, there won't be enough cod and dolphins. The plants in the ecosystem will grow very much depending upon the quality of the water. So if too much runs off from the land, that could poison the sea for the creatures there. Organisms, creatures. Creatures isn't a very scientific word. You've got a couple of birds up here. So all of these animals, plants, organisms, they're all interrelated. And we say, in the word for that, and again I'll put it in red so it appears, they are interdependent. Very much like the staff in a school. Teachers couldn't teach without staff there to make timetables, to design a timetable, to provide materials, without staff in the building cleaning the building up, making sure the power works, etc. We're all interdependent on each other, and in an ecosystem there's links between all the plants and animals where they're interdependent. As I said before, if you take away those phytoplankton here, if we disturb them or we poison them off, then there'll be less zooplankton, then there'll be less fish, and then all of a sudden you've got less dolphins and less cod. And therefore we sometimes affect our own food sort of supplies, with cod being the most popular fish in fish and chip shops. So the next sort of idea, the next word in red coming off ecosystems, as well as that idea that within an ecosystem they're interdependent, is competition. And you can have competition within the same species. So these two are butting heads, having a fight, and that's over dominance. So in the same species they compete with each other, and only the best survive. And that links into evolution when we get onto that. So the strongest, the cleverest, the best hunters, the rabbits who actually detect foxes the best, they're the ones who survive. So there's competition with the same species. Then there's competition between species. So different species compete with each other for all sorts of things. And you just have to have a brief, a sort of overall idea of what could they be competing for. So within the same species, they're competing for the habitat, the place to live. Sometimes with the big cats, tigers, etc., you're competing for territory, part of the habitat, territory. You're competing for food. They're competing for mates. Quite often, the males will go through and have fights and arguments, etc., and they're working out which one's the strongest to pass on the genes. So the dominant male will be the one who does the most breeding. Between species, it's exactly the same. They are competing for habitat, they're competing for territory, they're competing for food, not so much mates, but there's competition. And don't limit it to animals in your thinking. When we're thinking about plants, they compete. So, I said at the start a mind map. We're now 7 minutes in, we've done a few ideas. What have we covered? We covered ecology as the main topic title for this area of biology, this whole section of B2 for our exams. That's why I've put a B2 up here. So I know this is one of the mind maps I want to be looking at getting ready for my biology 2 exam. We've covered the idea that an ecosystem is made out of all of the living and non-living things. I've put an example here like the rabbits and the foxes and the interdependence and them linking together, them living in a community in the same place, and it's the non-living things. And I've put an example here like the rainfall and the weather. So those are little memory joggers for me. And then I've gone to the idea of competition. So plants here competing for space and light. I didn't write light, I drew a little sun, so I can immediately see it when I look at it. And here I've drawn a puddy cat competing for mates, for habitat, for territory. So if your mind map looks like that so far, great. If it looks different, that's great as well. If you've just got the words and no pictures and you're not trying, you shouldn't have loads and loads of writing. There shouldn't be an explanation on here of what competition is. There's no point, because when your eye's drawn to it, looking at the cat, seeing the 3 words below, it's a memory jogger. The second time I look at that, it will stick more in my head. The third time I look at it, it sticks more in my head. And eventually, it'll come back very easily when I think about it or when I'm in an exam situation and I need to write about it. Okay, I'm not going to do that again, but that was just an idea of what it should look like by now. So, we just talked about competition. Every single animal, every single organism is in a competition with all of the others, not all of the others, all the others in their ecosystem for food, for water, for resources, etc. And talked a little bit about plants, just wanted to add a little bit more onto that. So on that last bit of mind map, we said plants compete for light. They also will throw out roots into the ground and they'll compete with other plants for water. They also get nutrients from the ground. Sometimes plants will compete by making loads of seeds. If you can make more seeds than the other plants around you, if you can spread your seeds further and further, then maybe you've got a better chance of winning that competition and more of you grow. Some plants can wipe out other plants. Gardeners will often call them weeds, but the weeds are often, dandelions will grow anywhere. They're much better competitors than daffodils, for example. So we deliberately, to make our gardens look pretty, we pull out the dandelions and plant the daffodils. But that's just more of a gardening thing. In nature, you won't see many daffodils around because usually they're not a very good competitor. So hopefully you've got the idea of competition and we can move on. So when we talked about the living and non-living things in an environment, those factors, those things that are in an ecosystem, the proper terms for it are biotic and abiotic. So if I'm talking about abiotic factors, what I'm talking about is non-living. So if I ask the question, what will affect the population of foxes this year? What will affect the population of foxes this winter? Well, from abiotic factors, we're going to have temperature. If it's a really cold winter, some of the young foxes will die off. If it's a really cold winter, there won't be so much food around for them. So temperature is a key abiotic. It's not a living thing, but it's a thing about their environment. Space and habitat. How much space and habitat have the foxes got? How much wild land where they could build their burrows, their sets? Or are we taking more and more of that, and so there's less room for foxes? Lots of foxes have moved into cities because there's more food availability. But a key thing, an abiotic factor. So sometimes you're asked to list abiotic factors, so as soon as you see the word abiotic, it's not living. A, not, bio, living. Remember, the words in red, the main words, are the ones going on your mind map with maybe an example. Biotic factors, much easier. Biotic meaning living, because biology is a study of living things. And then underneath that, give some examples. So, prey. In fox's case, rabbits, mice, any other small mammals. Other competitors. In some areas of the world there'll be foxes, but there'll also be wolves, and they both want the same thing, and actually the wolf will eat the fox. So actually they've got competitors. So therefore maybe it's predators. Maybe a new predator moves into the area, and it's a biotic thing. And then this one, I'm going to put it in red. Cross that out. P-A-T-H-O, pathogen. Pathogen. So from Biology 1, pathogens. So pathogens are microorganisms, so tiny organisms that cause harm. And what you'll learn more about in Biology 1, especially when we get the videos for that, there's 4 types of pathogen. Hopefully you can remember them. At this stage we've got some idea. Most people tend to remember that some pathogens are bacteria, and then with COVID, etc., they'll remember that some pathogens are viruses, and then you may well remember that some are protists, and the last one, things like athlete's foot, etc., fungi. That's covered in Biology 1, so that's sort of when it's used here like a new pathogen or a different pathogen affecting it. So biotic factors will affect the population, and abiotic factors, living and non-living. Adaptations. So it doesn't matter what they give you, whether it's a plant, an animal, a microorganism, everything is well adapted. If it wasn't well adapted, it wouldn't be around now. It would have been out-competed, it would have gone extinct. But adaptations are split. So make sure that when you put adaptations down on your mind map, maybe put the 3 around it: behavioural adaptations, structural adaptations, and functional adaptations. And what we mean by this, structural are the purely physical. So on here, I'm going to put spines, because I've chosen a hedgehog. If I'd chosen an eagle, I might put sharp claws. Behavioural, I'm going to write curls in a ball. If I'd chosen a rabbit, I might have written doesn't come out during the day when the predators are around, where it might easily be seen. It's usually at dawn and dusk rabbits are out feeding. So, but a hedgehog curls in a ball. That's a behavioural adaptation. It behaves in a certain way to help it. Obviously, stop it being eaten. And functional, well, they have a very, very good sense of smell. And they're very, very good at picking up vibrations in the soil. Not the best eyesight, but then actually what they're usually doing is snuffling around and using their nose to find their food, whether it be that insects or worms or whatever. So make sure that you can give examples and you know the difference between behaviour, the way you act, structural, the physical side of things, and functional. What about some of the senses there? For a rabbit you might say functional or the hearing. They have amazing hearing. They have vision that goes 360 degrees, so they can see all around them, unlike us. Okay. This is purely here for you to think about. This is an Arctic fox. Small nose, small legs, small ears, bushy tail, thick fur, quite chubby, lots of layers of fat. All adaptations to help it live in a very cold environment. The whiteness, a structural thing, help it fade in so that it can sneak up on its prey. And the opposite, the fennec fox, look at the size of his lovely ears. Here's a fox that lives in a very hot climate, and those ears means that it's got a big surface area. So some adaptations are, for example, the surface area ones. Here it's got long skinny legs, big surface area, and the big surface area allows it to lose heat. Just like in that Arctic fox, he had small ears, so he cuts down on heat loss. So we talked about interdependence, and I mentioned the word food chains and food webs. So as we go along through a food web, there's different stages in an ecosystem. In an ecosystem, the producer, this word here in red, the producer is the plant. The producer is making the food for the rest of the organisms in the food chain. Anything then that is eating other things and feeding off them is a consumer. You can have a primary consumer, and primary, just like primary school, primary means first consumer. That means the primary consumer here, primary consumer, is a herbivore. It's eating the plants. A secondary consumer may well eat plants as well, but it also eats other animals. So just like you go to primary school, then we go to secondary school. The primary consumer is the first creature eating something else, organism, eating plants or whatever, and the second one, and so on and so on. The only other thing I might say is you might want to put this word in red, decomposes. So when things die, or when things excrete and make their poo, there's other animals, other organisms, insects, worms, bacteria, that feed off and decompose dead matter, sometimes called detrivores as well. They feed off dead leaves, etc., which is what takes all of our waste away eventually. So energy is passed on. So I'm just going to change colour for a minute. One key thing to note, energy is passed on through a food chain, but energy is lost. This little creature here has not got all the energy from the plant, and this little creature here is running around, it's moving, it's growing, it's mating, it's losing some of the energy, so there's not as much energy to pass on to the next level. And then, again, more energy loss. So each level up a food chain, energy is lost. That's why you tend to have lots and lots, in the example I've used so far, you might have millions of grass plants, you might have thousands of rabbits, but you might only have 50 foxes living from that, because the energy isn't all passed on. So the numbers of an organism tend to reduce the further up a food chain. And food chains can be a little bit misleading. This is more realistic. So food chains are used for teaching, but in more realistic terms, here we have a food web. The butterfly isn't just eaten by one creature. Here, the butterfly would be eaten by the frog and the dragonfly. The dragonfly then is eaten by the thrush. The thrush is eaten by an eagle or a wolf, and so on and so on. So from this, what you'd be expected to do is identify who the producers are. So hopefully we realise that the producers are the plants down here, and everything above this blue line I'm drawing is a consumer. Some of these, like the grasshopper, is a primary consumer. The rat up here, eating grasshoppers, is a secondary consumer. And the other thing to mention is predator and prey. The grass is not prey. It has to be an animal that is hunted and eaten by another animal. So the grasshopper is prey. The python, eating wolves, eagles, rats, frogs, whatever it can get its hands on, the python is a predator. It hunts, kills and eats other organisms, other animals. So again, there's 4 words in red. We've already dealt with producer and consumer, but you can use the others. And then we talk about predator and prey cycles. So this blue line is the number of rabbits, and the orange line the number of wolves. And if you follow it, it looks like, oh look, the number of rabbits is going up. Shortly after that, because there is more rabbits around, more food, the number of wolves starts to go up. And the number of wolves gets really high because they've had loads of food and they mate lots. Because there's loads of wolves here, where I'm sort of drawing at the moment, then the number of rabbits starts to drop off and it declines. It goes down and it drops off because there's too many wolves. Now there's less food. What happens to the number of wolves? It dies off. Lots of the wolves die off until the number gets really low. And then because there's less wolves around, the number of rabbits goes up. So quite often, when we're looking at environment, we have to look at the cycle. Over time, predators and prey tend to go in cycles with numbers increasing and decreasing. So we can't just measure it at one time and say, oh my god, it's dropped off loads. We have to say, we'll need to measure it over a long period of time, work out what the cycle is, then we can work out if we're having an effect on it. And so then we have these representations, and these are called pyramids of biomass. And I said before, there's not enough energy each level. When we go from those phytoplankton, those little plants in the water, to the zooplankton, eating them, a lot of the energy is lost, about 90%. When we go from the zooplankton to the heron, eating those, again, 90% of the energy is lost by the creatures, by the organisms, in movement, in reproduction, in growth, and just in inefficiencies. And again, so there's not as much mass, there's not as much energy higher up a food chain. So food chains don't tend to be very long. If you're asked a question about that, if you're asked a question about why are food chains usually 4 or 5 organisms long, the answer is because lots of energy and biomass is lost along the way. Now I'm going to put the word biomass in red. It's very self-explanatory. It is the mass of living organism. So they've worked out that all of those herring together in one environment would weigh 10,000 kilograms. That would be the mass of those organisms. So it is just the mass of the living things, hence living mass. Talked a little bit about this when I mentioned the detrivores, the decomposers. So dead organisms and waste will take the remains of living things and they respire them and they return the carbon dioxide back into the air. Carbon dioxide can then be taken in by plants during photosynthesis. It can be used to make glucose. I'll write that on there in red. So glucose is the main product of photosynthesis that you'd know. That can then be used to make proteins and fats by plants. They can all be taken into an animal when they eat the plants. Plants themselves release some of the carbon dioxide back into the air. The animals breathing out release carbon dioxide back into the air, and when they die, it goes back in. And then the carbon dioxide is available again to go back into different plants, then go into different animals. So the materials you are made from today, eventually, when your life is finished, you will be recycled, your carbon will be returned to the environment, and then that carbon will be available again to other living things in the future. So we have this carbon cycle going round and round. So for your mind map, you're looking at the main stages of this. I'll just put those in purple. And the main stages would be photosynthesis by plants, capturing carbon from the air, decaying organisms, respiring the remains of living things, respiration by animals, respiration by plants, and then usually this is our interference, us burning fossil fuels. Fossil, not facile. Us burning fossil fuels, us burning fuel in cars, etc., for power stations, we are increasing the carbon dioxide in the environment. And then similarly, easier in a way, the water cycle. You've probably studied this before, both in Key Stage 2 and in Geography at Key Stage 3, but proper terminology: precipitation for rainfall onto the mountains, the surface runoff, water going into rivers, rivers flowing into the sea, evaporation from the sea and rivers back into the air, condensation in the air when it gets cold, and back to rainfall. So again, water goes round and round in a cycle. And then this, well, biodiversity. Starts from a point of you need to know what diversity means, and diversity is this range. If we say it's a very diverse population, what we mean is there's lots of difference there. There's a whole range of living things. And when we look at an environment, there may be 300 different living organisms there. So let's just say, for example, there's 300. But then we pollute it a bit, and what we do is we measure it later and there's only 270 left. And we measure it 10 years later and there's 150 organisms left. Some of what we are doing with reducing rainforest, deforestation, pollution, increasing carbon dioxide, water pollution, litter, taking all the land, taking more land for living, for shops, for roads, all of those things are reducing biodiversity, and that affects the whole ecosystem. And so one of the things that we're working on as a species, one of the things that COP26 we're working on, is how do we stop reducing the range of biodiversity. This graphic is purely to show over time we were massively reducing biodiversity by killing species off, overhunting, taking away their land, and then by the year 2010 there was a lot of recognition of this, and they came up with 3 future models. The model that if we did more sustainable production, more sustainable consumption, we started recycling more and stuff, what we could have is by the year 2100, when you'll be extremely old, we could be looking at an increased biodiversity going back to where we should be. Or we could continue the trend but increase conservation, the yellow line, which is the one we've more or less followed, where biodiversity continued to decrease but now is starting to stabilise as long as everybody sticks to what they've agreed. Or the grey line, we could carry on doing exactly what we were doing before, making no efforts to recycle and reuse and control population, and therefore biodiversity would get worse and worse. Remembering, we feed from all of these different ecosystems, so if we reduce the biodiversity, we will affect ourselves in the long term. So you need to know what biodiversity is, you need to know how we affect it. That's why on this one, how do we affect it? Taking more land for farming, plants and animals, taking more lands for industry and buildings, taking more lands for housing, for parks, farming even in mountainsides and stuff, water quality and affecting that from factories, from houses, all different ways that we can affect a natural environment and reduce biodiversity. Mentioned deforestation. Deforestation comes in lots, comes into reducing biodiversity, comes into global warming, because the forests, the trees, are a massive sink of taking away carbon dioxide from the environment to stop global warming. If we take away the trees, they're not removing the carbon dioxide. What's the main reasons we cut down the trees? There they are. The main reason is agriculture, is farming. just for the wood itself, to use wood as a fuel, or here 8% of it for cattle ranches. And that's one of the main reasons for Brazil deforesting the rainforest in the Amazon, is to have land to grow, well, for cattle to feed off the grass. Now, what's the knock-on effect? So on this, really, what is the impact of our actions? What's the impact of us with global warming, with reducing biodiversity, changing weather patterns, etc.? Well, I don't need to tell you, they're all there in pictures. So here we have the ice caps melting. Here we have increased storms, floods. The biggest storms, the biggest floods, the hottest heat waves ever recorded in the last 200 years have all happened in the last 10 years. Raising temperatures of some lands and drought means more forest fires. It's not a coincidence that we've changed the environment and we're having very extreme weather on the planet. Therefore, there's quite a lot of movement now and a lot of understanding for why we need to reverse some of the effects of what we've done if we want to continue living here long term. So, what could we do about it? Well, breeding programs for endangered species to make sure they don't go extinct, protecting rare habitats, putting back in hedgerows and field margins where hedgehogs and foxes and loads of organisms live, rather than making massive fields. Reducing CO2 emissions, and lots of companies will now advertise that they're carbon neutral. Reduction of deforestation, stopping that cutting down of wood. Recycling, rather than using landfill. So all of these things together, there's agreements for them all, along with the use of coal and oil and gas as a fossil fuel and using renewable energy. All of that means we're very much in control of this and we can make the environment back to a very healthy place. And that's this bit finished. So you should now have a full mind map full of everything and all the main points from ecology. You've done the hard work. It's there now. Looking at that now and again, maybe adding little bits to it that you find out elsewhere or in revision or in class or from revision guides. Reviewing that regularly means ecology will be a subject you're then really strong on when you come to biology 2. Okay, thank you.